Good morning. It's good to be with you all this morning. I'm glad that we've come together today, and I'm excited to continue our series in the book of Hebrews. If you haven't already, I encourage you to turn to Hebrews chapter 4. We're picking up where we left off. We ended with the section that ends with verse 13 of chapter 4. And we're picking up in 4:14 and going through chapter 5, 4:14 through 5, verse 10. And that's supposed to show up on your screen. There we go. Okay. So this is what the passage we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to be looking at Jesus, our great high priest, in this segment. It's the shortest segment that I'll probably be covering in our going through Hebrews. It's so rich, so I don't really regret spending a lot of time on relatively small text with the pace that I'm trying to set through the book. But this is the passage we'll be taking on. The thing that's a little unwieldy about it is that it's not most of either chapter, let alone most of both. So I might slip up and say in Hebrews 4 and 5 or something like that, and I'm probably talking about this particular, the fun word is pericope. But these few paragraphs of Scripture, these several verses of 4:14 to 5:10 is what we're talking about. And it sets up for us Jesus, our high priest. Last time, we talked about seeing Jesus first in chapters 3 and 4. Of course, that was just most of 4. We cheated a little there too. But what we see there in those texts is Jesus being prepared and leading us into our Sabbath rest. That's the thing that we see being emphasized. He quotes extensively, or at least repeatedly, from Psalm 95. Where David says, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as they did in the rebellion. And then he talks about that, and he ends Psalm 95:11 with, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. And so the Hebrews writer is looking at that text and saying, since Moses and even Joshua did not successfully lead the people of God into God's rest, and David, a long time after that, says there still remains a rest, because he says, today if you hear his voice. So there's still a rest for the people of God, and we are striving to enter that rest. Here, he says, as a conclusion, right, it all flows together. He starts in 4:14, since then we have a great high priest. So because of that, and because of what Christ has done and is doing, we have something to do about that. I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. I want to remind you before we go too much further, two things. One is the theme in Hebrews is preparation. In the first 7 chapters, we see the emphasis on Jesus having been prepared and the things he went through that prepared him to accomplish what he was sent to do. In chapters 8 through 11, we have a review of the preparation of the world, or of human history of God's people bringing us, like schoolmasters, right, like tutors from Galatians, to Christ, right? So the world is being prepared. Shadows and copies of the real heavenly things are being prepared, all so that, in chapters 12 and 13, we can be prepared, and we can prepare for permanence. The thing Jesus is first introduced to us as is not just as better than the angels, but more permanent than the angels. And we'll see as we go through it that we're becoming like that. The process of maturing in the faith is the process of becoming more and more permanent, more and more substantial, more and more real, but more and more permanent. So in this first verse in our text, 4:14, he says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." So we're going to talk about Jesus being prepared and qualified to be our high priest. And mostly, we're going to look at what it means for him to have been a high priest. We're going to talk a lot about priesthood today. We're going to look at Aaron's priesthood, Jesus' priesthood, and our priesthood at the very end. So I want you to know that I'm going to have Aaron on most of the slides, and I don't mean the guy. I mean to include the man Aaron, the brother of Moses, the first high priest of Israel. But I don't mean him exclusively. I'm using him as a type, as a figure for all of the Levitical high priests who served from Aaron's time to Jesus' time. Okay, so we're talking about the Levitical priesthood. We're talking about, I might use the term, the Aaronic priesthood. I'm not saying ironic priesthood, but the Aaronic priesthood or Aaron. I might just talk about Aaron and know that I'm talking about everyone like him after him, right? In the who was a high priest over Israel. So we're going to compare these. We're going to look first at Aaron's priesthood compared with Jesus' priesthood, and we're going to see some things really we have in view, especially the first 4 verses in chapter 5 that are going to be connected to the last 3 verses in chapter 4. So we're going to look at what it says about Aaron in 5, 1 through 4, and we're going to compare that with what it's saying about Jesus in the end of chapter 4. Verses 14 to 16. And then at the very end, we're going to talk about our own priesthood. And we're going to hope that that doesn't have to be excessively rushed. So with that, one of the things I want us to do is to go through and read these first 4 verses. And we're going to point out in the text the 4 things that we're going to look at. So, and just read with me. The points I'm going to draw out of here are on the board. The numbers in blue parentheses are the verse numbers you're going to find these points in. So reading it from 5:1, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God." So that's thing number 1 we're going to look at, that a priest acts on behalf of men in relation to God. To offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. We're going to combine that with some language for later, but that's the second thing, is offering gifts and sacrifices for sins. Aaron, that's the he, right? The Aaronic priesthood. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward because he himself is beset with weakness. So that's the third thing. We're going to look at dealing gently with the ignorant and wayward. And then the 4th thing is that because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins. Or I'm sorry, this goes in with the second point about offering gifts and sacrifices. Because Aaron himself is a sinner too, right? Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. So we'll call that 2a. And then number 4, "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was." If we take a high-level reading, we're going to point out some words, starting in 5:1, going through this real quickly. Every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men. Coming down in verse 4, "No one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was." And then in verse 5, bonus, "So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to them." So we see that appointment is also exalting, right? It's a raising up of his status. So we're going to spend the least time talking about those 4 words. But I do want you to know that every high priest was chosen, was appointed, was called, and was exalted to that position so that they could serve the people of Israel and act on their behalf in relation to God. So let's talk about that for a moment. That the priest acted on behalf of man in relation to God, from 5 verse 1. That was their job, right? The system was that you, the common Israelite, sinned, or just because you go through the year and you're unclean for various reasons and you're celebrating feasts in various ways, you come to the tabernacle, later you come to the temple and the priest, and what we'll focus on is the Day of Atonement, because that seems to be the part of the priesthood that the Hebrew author is concerned with the most throughout the book. Actually, it seems to be true. But in general, what's happening is you're coming to the priest, and the priest is representing you to God. That's why there's this one man who once a year goes into the Holy of Holies with blood for him after making sacrifice for himself, and then with blood for everybody else. He goes in representing man to God. The life that he lives, there's also language in Exodus and I think Leviticus for sure about the Levites being the dedicated people that the rest of Israel doesn't have to be. Like there's a sense, so don't mishear me, every Israelite was commanded to be devoted to God. But they were also going to have something like, I hesitate to use the word, but something like a normal life. And the priesthood, which is only some of the tribe of Levi, right? The priesthood was going to live a highly devoted life that did not look so much like a normal life. And they are representing, in all of their devotion, in all of their daily practices, they're representing man to God. So, of course, one of the things that let's look at two of the ways that it's stated. And I guess I'm just giving it all to you from the get-go, so enjoy. So first of all, the first thing that he says is that every high priest is chosen from among men, right? So Aaron, I'm going to blow your minds right now. He was a human. Let me press the issue. He was an Israelite, right? He was one of us. And he was chosen from us to represent us, to go for us into the Holy of Holies before God, right? He's from among us, and he's representing our sin. He's representing sinful people, right? And Jesus does that, but even better, right? He also took on the form of flesh, right, and became like us, so that he could act on our behalf to God, in relation to God, right? That is him being priestly. But he does it even better, and we're going to talk about that a lot. But he definitely represents sinners to God, but he does something that the priest kind of did, which is representing God to man, acting on God's behalf to man. And this is one of the ways where it took two men to really do one of the things that Jesus does. It's really clear with like Moses and Joshua, right? So Jesus leads us out of slavery and into the promised land. But Moses, who's a type, a shadow of that, he led us out of slavery in Egypt, right? He led the people out of slavery in Egypt, but he couldn't bring them into the promised land. Joshua does. But Joshua didn't lead them out of Egypt, right? So Jesus does the one thing that it took two men to do. Moses represented God to man in giving the law. Moses was up there on the mountain with God, conversing with him face to face. We talked about Moses more last time. But Moses even came down with a face so brilliant with the glory of God that they had to have him put a veil over his face, right? Because it was terrifying. He represented God to the man, to the people of Israel. He was the voice of God to them like a prophet, right? In Aaron's priesthood, there's a semblance of that. There's a part of that. There's some responsibility for the priest to teach the people about God's law. And so in those ways, you are acting on God's behalf to man, but mostly what they are doing is they are acting on man's behalf to God. Jesus is absolutely doing both. Jesus absolutely came down acting on God's behalf to us. In fact, I want you to notice that while it's absolutely true that Jesus, because he was a partaker of our same earthly nature, that he's chosen from among men to become this high priest. But he's not from among men, is he? He's not from here. He goes the other way first. Remember, Aaron was one of us, just a human like us. He was one of the tribe of Israel, and he was exalted, chosen to be the one who would go in once a year to the Holy of Holies. Jesus is from the Holy of Holies. And not the mere shadow or copy of the Holy of Holies that Aaron and everyone like him went into, but the realer Holy of Holies. He comes from God, and that's the point of 4:14 and of chapter 4, verse 14. And the way that he says that, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, which is talking about him coming down from the highest heavens through the middle heavens into the lower heavens and down to earth. So he doesn't come from the people and go into the presence of God until after he leaves the presence of God, where he's from, to represent God to man. He comes from the Holy of Holies. And that's why he is supremely qualified to go back to the Holy of Holies on our behalf. So he comes from God. And just in case you're wondering why I'm so confident about the direction in which he's saying he passed through the heavens, he emphasizes that this is Jesus, the Son of God. Not the son of Levi, the Son of God passed through the heavens. He came this way first. And so in this way, among others, he is a better high priest than Aaron or anyone like Aaron could have been. Because he does both, and he does both of them better than Aaron could have. He also, going back to our list here, the second thing is that he offers gifts and sacrifices for sins. The high priest offers sacrifice for self and others. We'll consider how that stacks up. So remembering that Aaron goes in into the holy and most holy places with sacrifices for sins, with gifts to God, both on his own behalf and for others. And so you would bring your things to the tabernacle, to the temple, right? And maybe it was a free will offering, hence gifts, right? Maybe it was your guilt offering. Maybe you had done something wrong, you knew it was wrong, and you come and you bring that. Maybe you did something in daily life that everybody has to do, or naturally does anyway, that makes you ceremonially unclean, and there's a point at which you go and present yourself to the priest, right? So, but in any of these cases, in the vast majority of these cases, you're bringing something to God, but you can only bring it so far. You bring it, if memory serves, to the courtyard, right, to the entrance of the tabernacle. And then the priest takes it from there. But Jesus is better than that, because he goes further up and further in. He goes higher and farther than Aaron did. Aaron could only get so far as the mercy seat, as the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies, which represented the presence of God. And in a real sense, through the Old Testament, we see the presence of God there, but it's just a shadow. It's a copy of the presence of God. Because for all the terror that the presence of God caused on the mountain of Sinai, that was a fraction of God's real presence and what it's like to be in God's real presence. So Jesus is a better priest because he brings our sacrifice closer to God. He lays it at his actual feet. He doesn't go into a temple made with human hands. He doesn't serve him with human hands as though he needed anything that way. He goes to the throne itself with a better sacrifice, because as we'll see later in Hebrews, the blood of bulls and goats could never take away the sins of the people. But the sacrifice that Jesus brought was good enough that it can. And it does, and it did. Right? And so he offers a better sacrifice, a better gift, closer to the throne of God, laying it, offering it literally, really to the Father. And of course, he is the way through which we can bless God or give gifts to God, because we're reconciled now through Christ, and we have access to that throne. And one of the things that we do is we bring ourselves and we bring things in our lives and surrender them to God through Christ, which is better. I would say we're not unpacking that right now in particular, but it's better than what they could do through Aaron. Not only is he bringing from us to God, but he is the thing brought to God, right? He offers himself. He is the gift. He is the sacrifice ultimately. But again, he's better than Aaron because it goes both ways. Because in Ephesians 4 and verse 8, let's see if I can pull this up quickly on the slides here. Let's look at Ephesians 4, beginning in verse 7. We're actually going to skip a couple verses and go to 11 and following after this. So roughly Ephesians 4, 7 through about 13-ish or so. Paul says to the Ephesians, "But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift." So here's this language of Christ's gift. "Therefore it says," and now he quotes from Psalm 68:18. He says, "Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men." And then he goes on to explain. Sorry, I can't help it. It's really weird what he does here. I can't quite figure out. This is not what Psalm 68:18 says. It's absolutely the verse that he's quoting. And he gets most of it right. And I'm not telling you that the inspired apostle made a glaring mistake. I think he does something deliberate. I think he's actually, we might say he's parodying. He's making a parody of Psalm 68:18. Because what Psalm 68 verse 18 actually says is all of this, except that it says, "And he received gifts among men." And Paul very nonchalantly misquotes. He uses a word that at least Greek word, actually it's the Hebrew word for received gifts. Out of the 960 times that Hebrew word is translated as anything in the Bible, it never means anything that you're giving to someone else. It always means that you're receiving, that you're accepting, maybe you're even seizing it or grasping it. Maybe you're marrying someone, and that's a taking this person, right, to have. So that's the only way that Hebrew word is ever used. And Paul very casually says, as it's written, he gave gifts to men. Also that he can make this point about the gifts that we have from Christ. I go on that little tangent because one of the things we're doing in our book of Hebrews, in our going through Hebrews, is we're learning how the New Testament Christians actually used the Old Testament. And sometimes it would be what we would call fast and loose, with an emphasis on the loose. I just want to plant the seed of what kind of precedent this sets. This does not mean you can go changing words willy-nilly to mean whatever you want it to mean. There's a context here. And the thing that he's saying is true. And he uses a verse that gets him almost there, and he changes a thing to land the plane. So he when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. I'm chickening out and skipping the bit where he unpacks in verses 9 and 10 what it means that he ascended, except that he first descended. But then he goes back and he picks up what that gift is. What did he give? He gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. And of course, I don't think this sentence ends for like a minute. So we're just stopping here. But when we see this gift that he gives, so Christ, our high priest, goes in behind the curtain into the Holy of Holies, but something more real than the Holy of Holies, to the actual throne and presence of God, not the mercy seat, which represents a place where God sits or resides, but the actual throne of God, bringing our gifts to him. But he also gives gifts to men. And of the gifts that he gives us, one of those kinds of gifts is the people that he puts around you to equip you to do your job. And I mean vocation, not occupation. I mean the calling on your life, not the way that you make money. I'll make it even more clear than that. I don't mean helping you do your job as a post worker or a lawyer. I mean doing your job as a functioning part of the body of Christ. You keep reading in Ephesians 4, and that's exactly what he's spelling out. That's our job. Okay. And so the gifts that he gives us is in part one another. There are many other ways to look at the gifts that Christ gives us that are not, especially in the book of Ephesians, right? Phrases like all the blessings in the heavenly places in Christ or something along those lines, right? So there's a lot of things that we get because of Christ, he giving gifts to men. But this is the one that's spelled out for us in Ephesians 4, is that he has given you people to help you do the work of ministry. So for this and several of the other reasons we're looking at, he's a better priest. That ought to have been this slide that we left. So he acts on our behalf to God and vice versa, unlike Aaron. Jesus offers gifts and sacrifices for sins, but doesn't need to sacrifice for himself and others because unlike Aaron or anyone like Aaron, he never lived a life that needed atoning for. We didn't talk about that, but there you have it. Here's my favorite part. Because I think it's the weirdest. Tells you about my taste. It's weird. If you think a little bit about what he's saying here. Now, what he says about Aaron in verse 3 absolutely makes sense. Because he says, verse 2 of chapter 5, he, being Aaron, and everyone like him, every high priest, lowercase h, lowercase p, like in verse 1, he can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. So what we're seeing here is the precedent that sinful people should not be ugly to other sinful people when it comes to light that they are in fact sinful people. Right? Now, sometimes we have a bad habit of doing that anyway. We have a bad little habit of forgetting. We get this kind of special amnesia where we forget our sins and our struggles and our problems. But when somebody else's sins and problems and struggles comes to light, we say, oh, could you imagine? And obviously, that is a very unbiblical attitude. The high priest was expected to be gentle, and we just talked about this last week, right, with David, to be gentle with the ignorant and the wayward, because he was also someone who was weak. You know what doesn't make as much sense is what it said about Jesus first in the end of chapter 4. In verse 15 of chapter 4, where he says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." Doesn't perfection give you a right to be harsh with the imperfect? Doesn't it give you a rational, a reasonable reason to be unkind to people who are not as good as you? One of the reasons I say that is because we see it in children oh, that's not coming up the way that I thought. Oh, yeah, well, it will in a second. Yeah, we're going to go here first. That's what we're going to do. Disregard the left half, but imagine someone that you know. Maybe it was you. Maybe it is you. There's probably some kids listening still. There's things, whether it's playing an instrument, whether it's learning math or English, whether it's kicking a soccer ball or some other athletic thing that came kind of naturally and instinctively to you, and you're able to progress really well and really easily in that course of study or practice. And maybe if you're in a team or you're in a music class and you're getting things right, it can be really frustrating because it doesn't seem like it's hard to you. And so when the kid in the back keeps flunking the chords, like, it's not hard. Just do it right. Just be better. Or you're the one kid who keeps asking how you find the radius of the circle. Like, we've been over this. It's not that hard. Because it comes easily to that child, right? And so because they are so good at it, they might be really unkind or at least impatient, but they might not deal very gently with those who struggle. And that seems normal. That seems reasonable to us. I think we know better than to say that it's right. But it's really weird that we're expected to just go right along with the author when he says that naturally our high priest, who suffered and was tempted in all things as we are and remains sinless, is sympathetic, obviously. I want to talk about a different environment where people struggle. Some of you will get this sooner than others. So what's being shown here is not a horn blaring, it's a bell. But I appreciate the effort. We'll carry on. I know it's an alarming subject. I think everybody who's leaving to check on that knows what I'm going to talk about already. So this is a picture of a bell in Coronado, San Diego, California, which is the home of SEAL training, right? So to become a Navy SEAL, you first go through, and I say first kind of loosely, there's some prep for it, but you first go to BUDS, which is Basic Underwater Demolition and SEAL Training. And it is a month of really hard stuff. It is a month of things that you don't enjoy. And so when you show up to be as a candidate to become a SEAL, that it's going to be hard. And they tell you that, right? And that's why you're there. You're there to do this really hard thing so that you can go and do really hard things in the mission field, right, in combat. But they tell you, they point it out to you, and it's fairly prominently displayed on site there, that there's this bell. And when you can't take it anymore, when you're ready to quit, go ring the bell. And so by the end of Hell Week, the last week of BUDS, there's a line of helmets by this bell of the people who dropped out, the people who gave up and went and rang the bell. And the Navy SEALs, everybody who wears the holy trident, being sarcastic with the use of the word holy there, I'll clarify, that everybody who wears that trident didn't ring this bell. I learned recently that you do ring it when you graduate, but I haven't heard anybody actually say that. We can make something out of that, but we don't have time for that this morning. We can talk about that later. But here's Here's what I have heard and read SEALs talk about when they talk about buds, when they talk about the hardship, and they talk about people who did ring the bell. No SEAL despises the quitters. They don't get made fun of. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of exceptions sometimes, but as a rule, right, we're dealing with humans. As a rule, it's not really the thing in the community to make fun of the people who quit. Now, first of all, the instructors really want you to quit. They do everything in their power to make you quit. And I think part of that is because I've learned from people who have been through it that I think to be an instructor in buds, you have to be a sadist. But that's not why they want you to quit. That's not why they make it hurt. They want you to quit because if you quit on a beach in San Diego, that's fine. Nobody dies because of that. But if you're out in Baghdad or wherever your mission is, and that's when you decide to quit because it's hard, people die. And so the instructors really want the quitters to quit in training so that they don't quit when lives are at stake. But the people that quit, here's the real point, don't get made fun of because when there's conversations between somebody who is a SEAL and somebody who is almost a SEAL, and the almost talks about that time they rang the bell and what made them do it. The SEAL says something like, I remember that. I wanted to quit at that part too. And the fact that they didn't isn't exalted as a reason that they're better than the other person. It says, I finished the marathon and I understand every leg of that run. I finished the training and I know every part of how terrible it was to go through that. And I wanted to quit too. Here's why I didn't. Here's what got me through it. Here's why I'm telling you all of this. The fact that Jesus suffered and was tempted in all things as we are and remained sinless means that when we come to him with our brokenness and our sin, he doesn't look down at you and say, oh, you wretched quitter, you sissy, you couldn't just suck it up one more day. He says, I remember that. I wanted to quit too. I wanted to give up when that happened. I remember being so hungry, I wanted to act that way. I remember being so hurt that I wanted to sin. And he doesn't lord the fact that he was sinless over you to shame you. There's healthy shame already. He says, I remember that. And if you cheat a little bit and you look towards the end of Hebrews, you'll see that we're supposed to keep our eyes set on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured, despised the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God on high. So we have a perfect high priest. Here's what I need you to understand and take away from this. What I'm saying is that he wasn't perfect because it was easy for him to be perfect. When you're perfect because it's easy, it's natural for that to lead to an arrogance and a hatred of the people who just don't get it. It's not that hard. But when you're perfect, even though it was hard, that engenders compassion for people behind you on the way. Let's see which slide I want to go to. Jesus is our gentle high priest. He's gentle with the wayward and ignorant because sinlessness begets sympathy, not shame. We've got to wrap this up. We're not going to unpack these four. We're just going to go straight to our own priesthood. And we're going to, what I want you to remember, and the way that I'll kind of easy into this is, you remember in 1 Peter 5, when Peter is talking to the shepherds in his audience, the elders there, and he says, be a good shepherd. Here's what it means to be a good shepherd. Treat them like this and not these ways. And then he says, around verse 5 or so, because when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive your unfading crown. In the same way, I want you to remember, when we think about Jesus as our high priest, that you and I are also priests. So not only are we the people that he's representing to God, but we are the people that he is teaching, whom he is leading by example. And so our priesthood, our ministry, for which he gave us gifts, and we give each other gifts to equip one another for the work of that ministry, which is thinly veiled priestly language in Ephesians 4. But we have a priesthood to minister in. We are a kingdom of priests to our God from 1 Peter 2 and Revelation 5, which means that we act on man's behalf to God. And one of the most obvious ways that we do that is by praying for one another. One of the simplest ways that we act on man's behalf to God is that we pray for one another. And we make intercession through prayer for one another. But there's another way in which we are also acting on God's behalf to man. We are sharing the message of God with man, sure. But it's God who lives in us that is supposed to attract people to him. It is godliness that is winsome. And so when we think about our priesthood, we should think about the fact that we are supposed to take up both sides of this, go in both directions. There are more ways than prayer, I suppose, that you act on man's behalf to God that we don't have time to discuss. But there are also certainly ways that we act on God's behalf to man. When we offer sacrifices, we are supposed to be the sacrifices just like Jesus. Offer your bodies as living sacrifice. That's your acceptable and reasonable form of worship. Like, that's what your worship is supposed to look like, is giving yourself up. As you do that, what that's going to look like is not just hardship between you and God, but hardship for the benefit of your fellow man. I'll just leave you to think about that. Of course, we should be like Jesus, dealing gently with the ignorant and wayward, because we are weak like Aaron. But also in those things which you struggled with but overcame anyway, how much more sympathy can you have for the people who have gone through that and have been caught in that trap time and time and time again? You should look at them, you should be with them and say, I wanted to quit too. Here's how I didn't. Let's try this. And finally, of course, we can find scriptural language. We won't go through it this morning. We're over time anyway. That we are chosen, we are appointed, we are called, we are exalted with Jesus. And we'll also rule with him. I want to finish by reading the verses that we didn't get to in the section I said we were covering, which is verses 7 through 10. Of chapter 5. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Not next time, but probably the time after that, we're going to be talking about the priesthood of Melchizedek. Um, Next, we'll talk about the rest of chapter 5 and the first bit of chapter 6, at least, which talks about warnings against apostasy. But this morning, as we learn about Jesus, our high priest and our source of eternal salvation, we have some reflection to do about the priest that's offered for us and through whom we have access to the Father, and also about the kind of priest that we must be. And so I leave you with that message. And if you need to draw near to that throne in any way this morning, in a way that we can help, please let us know by coming forward.